Welcome again to Profiles on Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18. I'm Charley Walters. In its almost 200-year history, the Nantucket Atheneum has had only 9 library directors. The 9th and current one, Ann Scott, is with me here in the studio today, and she's here to tell us all things about the Nantucket Atheneum. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Charley. It's nice to be here.
First, obviously the Atheneum has done books all along, but it does much, much more than that at this point. And I went to your website this morning, and it says 1,300 programs and classes every year. Now, that's about an average of 4 a day. Obviously, there are more in the summer than there are in the wintertime, and they're not open 365 days a year. So we're taping this in August. There's an awful lot going on at the Atheneum today.
Right.
But why don't you talk about the offerings of the Atheneum other than books?
Yeah, those program experiences are really dynamic. And you're right, there have been books all along in the Atheneum's history. There's also been programming in the Atheneum's history as well. The Great Hall has a wonderful history of speakers and some programs that you might not have expected to have been held during that time. I think for me, libraries are really about librarians and the work that we do to connect people to information. And books are a great resource for that. And there are many other resources. There's music, there's theater, there's art. There are many classes and experiences. And I think most importantly, we connect people to other people. Whether that's through the imagination of an author or a musician or someone who wants to talk about a topic that's meaningful to them. That's really the approach. That's my approach and the approach of many of my colleagues that work for public libraries. And we're incredibly lucky right now to have a team that is really enthusiastic about that. We have some staff that have been with the Atheneum for quite a while, and we also have some new staff with new ideas, and that's exciting. It's really exciting to foster and watch the kind of experimental programming that's happening at this time. And by that, I just mean that we can try things on. And I think that may be why you see such a variety, because there are lots of kinds of things we would like to try to see whether or not they attract an audience. In a way, it's sort of like market research.
Well, if you go to the Atheneum's calendar, say in July and August, it's amazing how much stuff is going on. And even in the wintertime, it's not a blank page when you go to the calendar. There are still things, not as many things, but still things going on. But let me zero in on a couple of these things. When you say music, you have concerts, of course.
Right.
You have a guy who comes back most summers. Is his name Scott Millington, who gives harmonica courses?
Oh, we just had a harmonica class.
Yeah, that
right?
was the fellow. But of course, you can get a CD.
Right.
You can take out a CD the way you would take out a book. And with books, it's not just the printed material you also have audiobooks.
Right. We do have audiobooks, and we have a digital collection as well.
And how does that work?
That works just like you check out a physical book with your library card, except it gets downloaded onto your device to be borrowed for a period of time. You don't have to bring it physically back to the library. It just gets returned. Right, self-destructs, exactly.
And if there's a book, let's say you want a printed book, and the Atheneum does not have it, you can get them from another library, correct?
Right, we're part of a consortium, and it's a really great resource, and CLAMS is what it's called.
It's very appropriate.
Right, and yeah, we can reach out to other libraries and have those books delivered. When I first arrived here, I hadn't really thought about how that works on an island. How do we get those books from other libraries, and realize that they come via ferry and, water resistant pouches, and quite different from the courier systems on land.
You also have lectures, and there's a series that's been here for a number of years, the Geschke Lecture Series.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Geschke Lecture Series was begun with some help from Nan and Chuck Geschke, who are great friends and supporters of the Atheneum, and a matching National Endowment for the Arts grant. And the idea was to, really develop and build on the history that the Atheneum already has of bringing great thought leaders to the island and creating experiences for the community to broaden knowledge. I think we're always looking at empowering folks with new ideas. And we can also talk about some ideas that not everyone agrees on, and do that in a way that promotes civil discourse. And hopefully, the vision is to reduce some of the polarization that happens when we become so siloed from each other.
Speaking historically, who has spoken in the Great Hall?
Well,
going as far back as you want to go.
Sure. I think we love talking about Frederick Douglass having spoken at the Atheneum more than once. And I think what some people don't know is that Douglass and Maria Mitchell, the Atheneum's first librarian, had a beautiful friendship that existed right up until the time Douglass passed away, and she actually traveled to see him during that time. And that, I think, is really interesting history, because it's not something that you typically find when we're hearing about the different speakers at the Atheneum. I used to joke that that's a hard act to follow, Maria Mitchell, because right, she and Douglass, gained this world renown about the same time. They were both shooting stars, and they had this common ground in astronomy because of the North Star and the passage of so many enslaved people who were following that astronomy. So I think that was maybe part of the original link between the two of them.
Now, she became librarian here prior to becoming famous as an astronomer. And she was how old when she took that job?
18. And prior to that, she had also begun a school.
Before she was 18?
Before she was hired by the Atheneum, she had begun a school. And she was a little bit controversial because her school was open to really encourage children of all backgrounds to attend. And I think she ruffled some feathers in a good way.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned the Great Hall a moment ago, where Douglass and many others have spoken. But the Great Hall isn't just about its speakers. A lot of the Atheneum's artwork can be seen in the Great Hall. For example...
Well, that's true. Lots of portraits, and even beyond the portraits that have been restored recently with the help of a Nantucket Community Preservation Grant. We have some curiosities, because when we first began, before we were a public library, There were proprietors who owned shares of the Atheneum and collected not just art, but just curiosities from around the world. And at one point, when the NHA formed, a good deal of that collection went, into their hands for preservation and to share with the community. But we still have our own special collection, including some documents in the vault and items that we like to share with people. A really good place to learn about all of those items is on the Atheneum's podcast. And we just have some brilliant folks working in reference who do their best to tell those stories. And, whether it's around the art or whether it's around some of those pieces that we preserve, whether it's around some of the digitization that we're doing of whaling logs. All of those items contain wonderful stories. And I think that's the piece that you really get when you walk into the Atheneum and begin asking questions or having a conversation with someone who works every day in the Great Hall, surrounded by all of this history.
Those proprietorships lasted, I think, into the 1980s. And I actually bought a proprietorship. You could walk in, I think it was for $50. And they would give you a sheet of paper saying this is proof that you're a proprietor of the Nantucket Atheneum. It didn't mean that much. But then they stopped it. I'm pretty sure it was sometime in the 1980s. So I guess there are no proprietors at this point. Or do I have that wrong?
No, technically there are no proprietors, but it is an interesting question because we do rely really heavily on the friendship of people who support us through their time and through their talent, but also through their treasure and through their willingness to support the work that we're doing. And while they're not technically proprietors, they are good patrons, right? Who recognize that, unlike most public libraries who receive their funding from a municipality, we get a small portion of our operating budget in that way.
From the town of Nantucket.
From the town and other sources. And we have to raise 75% of it every year. And we couldn't do it without them.
Well, my understanding is it's an unusual arrangement. You are a private institution, and yet
Operating as.
Right, and that has to be voted on at town meeting. You wouldn't get that money were it not for the approval of the voters. But is that, a lot more about libraries than I'll ever know. Is this, how rare is this to have a private institution?
Oh, it's rare.
Really?
It's rare. I can't say with 100% certainty, but I don't know of another private organization that operates as a public library. And in order to call oneself a public library, we do have to receive a certain amount of funding
Well, there is no...
from the public.
This is the only library... How do I want to phrase this? Because the Mariah Mitchell Association has its own library and so on. But there really is no public library in the traditional sense of that term on Nantucket. The Atheneum it's kind of a hybrid, isn't it?
A hybrid of...
Public and private.
I would just say structurally, yes, private. But for all intents and purposes, in terms of how we operate, we're all public library. And the people who support us and our trustees who make some big decisions aren't making decisions around operating, right? So the way they impact how we operate as a public library is by choosing their director. And I have their support in making the choices that affect us on an everyday level and how we serve the community. Of course, they have input. So,
But they've hired you to do a job, and they're not micromanaging you.
they're
They
not micromanaging.
Yeah, I mean, they chose you because they don't, for many reasons, I'm sure, but in part because they know you can do the job and they stand back and let you do it.
They do, and I have to say that can be rare as well. I think that, in a lot of, so many libraries are struggling with this issue right now, right? Because people who fund you or determine what your budget looks like have a lot of power. And that power could be misused. And I think there are communities now where council members or commissioners have their own opinion about what should be in the library, what materials, what programs should be happening, and consider themselves to be an expert maybe on morality. So, and they are having an impact. They're having an impact because they can choose to fire a director who, is resistant to those changes.
I'm assuming that's not been an issue here, certainly not in my lifetime, to my knowledge.
No, I mean, I haven't heard of that history here at all. And my own personal experience of the Atheneum in particular and of its board is that it's a very healthy board, a very productive board, a very supportive board. And I learned that very early on because I arrived 6 months before the Atheneum had to close its physical doors for the pandemic. And I learned very quickly how much faith they put in my decision making. And it was a lot. I walked with them through every step, really talking through where I was getting my information, why I thought these would be good decisions to make. And maybe, occasionally someone would say, well, I don't think we should do it that way. But ultimately, that same person would turn and say, but it's your decision. We support your decision. Some of my colleagues in public libraries did not experience that. And that's hard on an organization.
Well, as a member of the public, it's good to hear that because they're offering you input, but they're not giving you orders. They're not dictating what you do, which in theory
And why would they want to?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, that's your job. They've hired you to make those decisions and to carry them out.
Right.
I want to pick up more on COVID, but let's step back. I'm curious how you got to Nantucket. First of all, where did you grow up?
I grew up in an area known as Red Clay, Georgia. It was an unincorporated part of the state in the upper northwest corner, about as close as you can get to Tennessee.
Where was the nearest library?
The nearest library was maybe half an hour away. Not too far away.
And how long did you stay there?
How long did I live in that area?
How long did you live in Red Clay?
Oh, well, until I graduated from high school.
And then where did you go?
Then I took off. Then I took off. I've had a lot of interest along the way, too. I mean, before I entered into the realm of public libraries, I would say that I didn't really have that specific intention growing up, but I did have a real love of literature. I did immerse myself in books. I was that kid that went to the library and came home with as many as they would let me carry out. And books were a solace for me and very, expansive. But I also love philosophy, psychology, theater. I'm a huge music lover, as you know, as well. And when you have a lot of interests as a young person, it's hard, I think, to sometimes find a clear direction. It's not a straight line. But I was always helping in libraries whenever I could. I would volunteer as a child. I got sent to the library when I finished my work and everyone else was still working. They'd say, go water the plants in the library or go help straighten the books. And I was a research assistant at one point. And then when I moved to Florida, to the Tampa Bay area, and there helped care for a grandmother who was very close to me. But when I first arrived, my first stop was, where's the nearest library? I want to go get my library card. And I went in, and there was a notice hiring a part-time library clerk. And the rest is history. I had a really great director.
So eventually you became a librarian in that area?
Yes, in that area. I had been working there for a while, kind of moving up in levels of responsibility. And an assistant director was on his way out. And my director said, I really want you in this role. And I really want to encourage and support the formal education of librarians. It was important to her. And so I went back and got my master's in library science.
And what was your next stop?
So I was there for 15 years in Florida and learned quite a lot. And then I was offered a position in the Rockies in a town called Basalt in the Roaring Fork Valley of Colorado. Basalt, half an hour from Aspen, another seasonal community, another area of great beauty, but different from Nantucket in some ways.
And very different from the Tampa Bay area.
Oh,
You
so
went
different.
From warm sea level to, were you at least a mile high in Basalt? I've driven through there. It's pretty high.
It is pretty high. And traveling around the area, you get even higher, right? But I would say, more than that difference, when I was working in Florida, I was working for a community that had been labeled as blighted. And there were lots of homeless people coming in, and there were a lot of mental health issues to deal with on a daily basis. And it was a very transient community. So the work was different, and different in that the needs were different. We're always trying to suss out what does the community need right now. And in a lot of ways, we always do our best to reflect that community in our collections, our programs, and who we choose to bring on in our staff. We want people to be able to see themselves reflected in our staff as much as possible. and foster that sense that they belong. So libraries aren't, one size fits all. When I was in Florida, I started a farmer's market that ran every week there and contained a good deal of nutrition literacy kind of built into that market. It was really needed there. And when I moved to Colorado, somebody said, "Are you going to start a farmer's market?" And I said, if the community needs a farmer's market, but I don't suspect that we're going to have the same needs here, right? And in
Not
fact,
in the Rocky Mountains, I wouldn't think.
they already had a farmer's market.
Oh, they did?
They already had a great farmer's market. There were other things there that were important.
Well, this fascinates me because you went from hot, sea level, urban to tiny town, Rocky Mountains, snow everywhere for at least part of the year. Had you sought out that kind of a change, or was it the particular job that attracted you to that?
I think these changes seek me out.
This is a big change.
It is.
Never mind the fact that it's, 2,000 miles or something.
Right. And yeah, I don't think that I never really expect for something to be as challenging as it may turn out to be. I have a good deal of confidence in my ability to adapt to a lot of different situations. And I guess I do have a bit of an adventurous spirit. And I was ready for a change. I had family pass away, and I wasn't really limited in terms of where I could travel anymore. I could embrace a big change, and it was good for me. It did have some challenges, but the one thing that it taught me was the importance of really immersing ourselves in our communities. And it grew my faith that I can anchor in pretty quickly, because I love people and I love learning about people, and every community has been unique. And yeah, it was a big change and a big challenge, and very worth it.
How long did you stay in Colorado?
I was there for 2 years, and I would have been
Just 2 years.
Yes, and I would have been there longer. I really loved being there. However, a friend reached out to me and said, "There's this opportunity that you might want to take a look at, because you might be a very good fit for it."
Meaning Nantucket.
Meaning Nantucket.
So another huge change. And another long move.
I had friends that were going, What are you, really?
And then to make full circle, you get here, and 6 months later, COVID hits. Now, had you been to Nantucket before you started the job?
I hadn't really spent any time. And actually, when I came out to meet trustees, I had some travel issues, and I had maybe 6 hours of free time to explore. And I walked around the cultural district, and it just felt right.
Felt different, I'm sure, from Tampa Bay and the Rocky Mountains.
It did feel different. And I don't know, I guess that's just, sometimes I see it as, I did some good things in the Tampa Bay area that I'm really proud of. I feel like I made a real contribution to that community. I feel like I helped bring positive change. And I do feel like librarians are positive change agents in a way. And I feel the same way, even though I was in Colorado for a short time. There were some major projects that we worked on, and I was able to accomplish a lot in a short amount of time. And I feel like I was needed here for some reason. And maybe, maybe there's just a little bit of magic in that, if you believe in that sort of thing.
Synchronicity as opposed to coincidence, maybe?
Mm-hmm.
When you started the job and COVID hit, I don't know how many people you would have gotten to meet in that space of time, but it must, to move to a tiny town you'd never lived in before, and all of a sudden you're confined to your wherever you live, I would think that would be very difficult.
It was very isolating.
Would you go into the building to work, or would you work from home, or both?
I went into the building.
Even when it was closed?
Oh, yeah, even when it was closed. Well, there were some of us, and more of us as time went on, that were in the building. But there was a great deal of time when I was working from home. And I always say that the real positive side of that, despite how isolating it felt, was that it really drove me even more to connect with my staff. And as a leader, it takes time to get to know your staff in a way that you know how they're going to be in a crisis. Mm-hmm. Like, I know I can ask this person to take care of this, and this person's going to need a little bit of this. You know them. You've spent time with them. That wasn't the case here. I had sort of a broad view and had spent some time talking with them. But and we spent some time on the phone. I spoke to my team leaders regularly and talked through situations, and also just connected as much as possible on a personal level. And you can't go through that kind of thing with a group of people and not come out the other side of it with either a stronger relationship or a relationship that is obviously not working.
How big is your staff?
We have around 23, I guess, something
really?
like that.
That big? Yeah. And how long was the building closed to the public?
This is a really tricky question for me that I'm happy to talk about.
That's not why I asked it.
No, I love that it's tricky. The reason that it's tricky is because I don't feel like we were really closed. Our doors were closed for a year.
Okay, but
there
were still things going on.
We were serving the public in a lot of ways, and
a lecture might be on Zoom and not in the Great Hall, for example.
Right, or somebody might deliver a bag of books to your door.
That's right, you were delivering books.
And then there was the vestibule, and then there were
the vestibule.
In the vestibule, folks could pick up their holds.
Oh, I see. Okay.
We developed a system for that, so we could just people could sort of curbside, pull up to the curbside, and.
So you were functioning all along. But how long was it until the building was open in its entirety?
It was, a year. After a year, we opened the doors, and we opened very quietly.
And with masks.
And with masks. And when I say very slowly, it was really intentional for me and my staff, because there were staff members who were ready to go. Like, let's do this. Let's open the door. We need to have people back in. And there were some staff people who were more concerned. Is this the right timing? Is this the right thing to do? And we wanted to move forward in a way that we wouldn't have to roll back, right? That we could continue. because there's so much confusion around backwards and forwards.
Yeah.
And I feel like as hard as it was for a lot of directors going into the pandemic, I saw more job shifts and more people leaving positions during the reopening.
That's interesting.
And I had a lot of pressure to announce or to give someone an answer. I think there was an article published somewhere. The title was, "When will the Atheneum open?" And I wouldn't say, because I really wanted the opportunity to stand out front on the steps and say to people, the door's actually open if you would like to go inside.
Well, what a reflection of the importance of the Atheneum to the community that you would see a headline in a publication.
Yes, of
When
course.
is it going to reopen?
Everyone was wanting to know. And once we started doing that and letting people kind of trickle in, seeing what the flow looked like, experiencing people with masks, we let more and more people come in. At first we were counting, but it wasn't long. It was, I'd say, 6 weeks maybe that we were more fully open. But I really loved, I didn't expect, the response that I would get. I remember it was spring, and it was one of those supernatural springs here where it's
We don't
like
get many of those.
twinkling. The weather was absolutely beautiful. And standing on those steps, inviting people in, I'll never forget it.
Well, we do get more nice springs have had more
Yes.
nice in recent years than we used to. It used to be winter and then it was summer. But climate change is changing a lot of things, which leads me to my next question. COVID was obviously a big challenge for the Atheneum. So are rising seas. And you have been spearheading awareness of this in the town.
I've been spearheading
Yes.
awareness. I think,
Well, a lot of people have, but
Yeah.
you're certainly one of them, as I can testify to. But you're a block away from the harbor. You are slightly higher up than other neighbors of the harbor, but you're paying close attention to this.
we've noticed we're a little higher.
But you're paying close attention to this
Oh, yeah.
with good reason.
We are paying close attention. I mean, there are multiple issues that we've got our eye on, whether it's the growth in the community and the changes that are happening there. But then, yes, on a more fundamental level, what's the Atheneum what are we gonna look like in, we can speculate how many years, but I think it's important that something is happening, right? Even if just initiating the conversation around it, looking at what other organizations are doing, talking about, what we've had evaluated, considering what our approach might look like. What is it going to mean for our materials and our services? And will we be able to use that lower level, right? So we need a lot more information. And I think that's what's important. I feel like we're all initiating that discovery, learning as much as we can about what this is going to look like and what we need to do. I think the big hurdle for everyone, this is true in the housing, right? Because we recently purchased housing. We had to.
Yeah.
We had to. We wouldn't have a library staff, really, without the housing. It has made a huge difference in our ability to retain and attract great talent.
Oh, I'm sure you're very fortunate to have it.
The stumbling block, if you want to call it that, I think the reason why, we all move toward those solutions a little bit more slowly is because they're expensive problems, right? It's going to take a lot of resource to address the issue.
Well, we've talked about this before, and even if you knew how you're going to address it, where does the money come from? And even if you had the money, how do you spend it? I mean, it's a problem for the ages down here, and it will always be one. It's not, the seas aren't suddenly going to unrise. They're going to gradually, well, they are already gradually and have been for a long time, creeping up. And I mean, something has to be done, and you don't want to kick it down the road and let your successors do it. That's no good either. But it's
and we rely on so much support, right? We rely on support. 75% of our support comes from private donations for our operations. We rely on support to help pay for this housing. You know, that we ask, and this is another big ask that at some point it's going to have to be addressed.
Now, the Atheneum's 200th anniversary comes up in 2034. Is this way too far ahead of time to be asking what you might be doing?
Yes.
Okay. I had to ask. When you're that close to that anniversary, I had to at least ask.
And you know, no, not completely. It's not too much to ask. I mean, I think, you know, we built our new summer fundraising model around celebrating what the Atheneum it has at its core, what it does best, why we're here, what makes us special. We'll, I'm sure, do more of that, but specifically what that looks like, I think, is going to be informed by the years also in between now and then.
Yeah, this may be a very different island in 11 years. And whether it is or not, we need to be prepared for it.
Right.
One last question before we go. What do you do when you are not at the library, when you're not working?
I spend as much time in nature as possible, and I spend as much time surrounded by good music as I can. One of the things that I started when I arrived here was just taking some singing lessons with the brilliant Greta Feeney, and those are the kinds of things that grow out of being isolated too. I think you start to understand what you need to sustain yourself. And of course, a good book. And I like to keep a book of poetry around, and I also like to keep a book of just philosophical reflection around. And then I love good fiction too. And it's great to be able to immerse oneself in a good story. And I think that it's also good for our mental health. And so many studies show that reading can really change your brain in profoundly positive ways, like meditation, which I also like to make part of my regular day.
Ann Scott, thank you for doing this.
Thank you for asking. Thank you for having me.
I should let you get back to work. This is
a
a work day for you, and
I call this a beautifully full day.
And we started the day at 12 o'clock, so I've interrupted your lunch hour. So I especially appreciate your coming in to do this show.
Thank you. We're going to get ready for a Geschke lecture series next.
Well, then carry on.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Charlie.
For Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18 on Profiles, I'm Charley Walters. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you'll tune in again.